You know, when you go to the hospital with a broken arm, the diagnostic process is, well, it's incredibly straightforward.
Oh, yeah. Completely. It's practically mechanical, right?
Exactly. I mean, the doctor runs an X-ray, they pull up that stark black and white image, point to the jagged white line where your radius snapped, and they say, ah, there it is.
Right. The problem is entirely visible. It's quantifiable.
Yeah, you put a cast on it, and you know exactly how long it takes to heal.
It's the ultimate comfort of the hard sciences. We crave that kind of binary certainty, like a bone is either fractured or it's whole.
Right. A blood test is positive and negative.
Exactly. The physical world, for the most part anyway, allows us to categorize our problems with just absolute precision.
Yeah. But the moment you step out of that physical realm and try to diagnose human cognition, when you try to map out how we process deeply held beliefs or, stubborn opinions, that X-ray machine just shatters.
It completely falls apart. You're suddenly operating in a diagnostic landscape that is just entirely murky.
Yeah, because you can't just slide a political ideology or like a business strategy into an MRI machine, right? You can't pinpoint the exact millimeter where the logic fractures.
And that lack of visibility, that's precisely why we are so incredibly terrible at recognizing our own cognitive failures.
We just can't see them.
No, we can't. Because the mind is a closed loop, and it is brilliantly designed to protect itself from the discomfort of being wrong.
Which, I mean, makes diagnosing our own ignorance one of the most difficult, counterintuitive things a human being can even attempt.
Oh, without a doubt. It goes against all our programming.
And that immense challenge is the foundation of our deep dive today. We are taking a really comprehensive look at the research and insights synthesized in Adam Grant's extraordinary work, Think Again.
It's such a crucial topic right now.
It really is. Because for decades, our culture has treated intelligence like it's simply a matter of processor speed. We operate on this assumption that the smarter you are, the faster your mental CPU can crunch the data, spit out the right answer, and solve the problem.
Right, and we've built our entire educational and corporate infrastructure around that exact model.
Processor speed model, yeah.
Exactly. We reward the fastest hand raised in the classroom, or, the most decisive voice in the boardroom.
But the source material we are looking at today completely dismantles that.
Yeah.
In a world that is evolving at just breakneck speed, having a fast processor is not the ultimate advantage anymore.
Not at all. The true cognitive superpower, the mechanism that actually dictates our long-term success, our capacity for innovation, and in some extreme cases, our literal survival, is cognitive flexibility.
The active, deliberate practice of unlearning.
Yes, the ability to rethink.
Which honestly is a terrifying concept for a lot of people.
Oh, it's deeply unsettling. Because think about the archetypes we celebrate in our culture, right? We revere the visionary who never wavers.
Oh, definitely. The leader who sticks to their guns despite all the opposition. We just idolize conviction.
We really do. But what the data reveals time and time again is that this exact rigidity, this refusal to update our operating systems when new data arrives, is actually our most dangerous liability.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if you were listening to this right now, I want you to treat the next hour as like a laboratory space.
I love that framing.
Yeah, we are asking you to take your most stubborn convictions, your most cherished assumptions about how the world works, and just leave them at the door.
Check your ego at the door, basically.
Exactly. We're going to examine the mechanics of the human mind through a completely different paradigm. And we're going to start by pulling this whole concept of rethinking out of the realm of abstract cytology and placing it directly into a horrifying, literal life or death crucible.
Because the stakes, honestly, they don't get any higher than the story of Wagner Dart.
No, they really don't. We need to go back to August 5, 1949. The location is Man Gulch. It's this rugged, incredibly steep valley in the Gates of the Mountains wilderness in Montana.
Very treacherous terrain.
Unbelievably treacherous. It is a blisteringly hot day, historically dry. Lightning strikes a ridge, and it starts a wildfire. So the Forest Service dispatches a crew of 15 smoke jumpers.
And just to clarify, these guys are the elite, right? They're basically the paratroopers of wildland firefighting.
Exactly. They drop into the valley to do what they have been rigorously trained to do, contain and extinguish the fire. But the mechanics of a wildfire in a steep gulch are incredibly volatile, right?
Oh, absolutely. Because heat rises, so a fire on a slope actually preheats the vegetation directly above it, drying it out and making it explosively combustible.
Just primes the fuel.
Yeah, a fire can race uphill significantly faster than it burns on flat ground. It's terrifying.
And that is exactly what happens here. A crew lands, they gather their gear, and they start making their way down toward the river to attack the fire from below. But then the wind shifts.
The worst case scenario.
Right. Suddenly the fire jumps the gulch. It is now below them, and it is roaring up the steep slope directly at them.
They're trapped.
Completely. We are talking about a wall of flame 30 feet high, moving at a speed that could cross 2 football fields in under a minute.
Wow.
The foreman, Wagner Dodge, recognizes instantly that containment is impossible. They're completely outmatched. So he turns his crew around, and they begin sprinting up this incredibly steep, rocky incline.
Running through knee-high grass.
Yeah, knee-high grass, desperately trying to reach the ridge before the fire swallows them.
They are essentially trying to outrun a localized hurricane of fire. Because large wildfires, they consume so much oxygen that they create their own weather systems.
They generate massive updrafts and terrifying winds. It's an apocalyptic scenario. The men are just running for their lives. And then Wagner Dodge does something that defies every single instinct of survival.
This is the part that is just so hard to wrap your head around.
It really is. With the main fire rushing up behind them, Dodge stops running. He pulls out a book of matches, strikes one, and sets the tall, dry grass directly in front of him on fire.
I mean, to the terrified men running alongside him, this must have looked like a psychotic break.
They must have thought he completely lost his mind.
The crew is fleeing a massive fire, and their leader just stopped to start a new one. One of the survivors actually later testified that he genuinely thought Dodge had gone crazy and was trying to burn them to death.
Dodge is frantically waving his arms, screaming at his men to step into the middle of the new fire he just created. But they completely ignore him. They just keep running up the hill.
Which is the totally natural human instinct.
Right. But Dodge stays. He watches his newly lit fire burn the grass away, leaving this patch of smoldering ashes. He lies face down in that charred, blackened area.
He takes his canteen, pours water over his handkerchief, presses it over his mouth to filter the smoke.
And he stays pinned to the earth for 15 minutes, while the massive superheated wildfire roars directly over his head.
It's just unbelievable.
And Dodge survives. But tragically, 12 of the smoke jumpers who kept running perished on that slope.
What's fascinating here is that the survival of Wagner Dodge is basically a masterclass in the mechanisms of cognitive flexibility under acute trauma.
Because his brain had to completely rewire itself in seconds, right?
Exactly. When the human brain encounters extreme, life-threatening stress, the amygdala essentially hijacks the prefrontal cortex. We revert to our most deeply ingrained automatic responses.
The classic fight, flight, or freeze.
Right. And if you are a highly trained firefighter, your deeply ingrained automatic response is to put out fires, never to ignite them.
Obviously.
And if you are a biological organism fleeing a massive threat, your instinct is to run away from the threat, not to step directly into a localized version of it.
So Dodge had to override both his professional training and his biological imperative in a fraction of a second.
He really did. He engineered what we now refer to in firefighting as an escape fire.
By burning the fuel ahead of him, he created a safe zone.
Yeah, so when the main fire reached him, it had nothing left to burn, so it simply passed over him. He rethought the entire paradigm of fire in the middle of an absolute panic.
But there is a secondary detail to this tragedy that is, from a psychological standpoint, just as shocking as the escape fire itself.
You're referring to the equipment.
Yes, the equipment. Just before Dodge lit those matches, when they were still trying to outrun the flames, he turned to his men and ordered them to drop their heavy tools.
Right, because they were running up an extreme incline carrying axes, saws, shovels.
And backpacks that weighed 20 pounds or more. It was slowing them down by precious seconds.
And yet a significant number of the men simply refused to drop their gear.
When the recovery teams found the bodies of the fallen smoke jumpers, some of them were still wearing their heavy backpacks. One victim was found still clutching the handle of his heavy forestry chainsaw.
It's absolutely heartbreaking.
When I read that, it stopped me in my tracks. Because on a logical level, it makes absolutely zero sense. I mean, why on earth would a human being running from a wall of flame refuse to drop a 20-pound weight when told to do so?
To understand the mechanism behind that fatal decision, we really have to look at the work of organizational psychologist Carl Weick.
Okay, what did he find?
He analyzed the Man Gulch disaster, and he proposed that holding onto the tools wasn't a physical failure at all. It was a profound psychological crisis rooted in identity.
An identity crisis.
Yeah,
While running from a fire.
think about it. Smoke jumpers don't fight fires with their bare hands. They fight them with highly specific, specialized tools. The Pulaski axe, the chainsaw, the shovel, these aren't just objects.
Yeah.
They're the physical manifestation of the firefighter's expertise.
They're the whole reason the men are on the mountain in the first place.
Exactly. So in the midst of a terrifying, chaotic situation, to drop your tools is to basically admit complete defeat. It is to surrender your role as a firefighter and accept that you are now just a vulnerable victim running for your life. Dropping the tools triggers an existential void.
The subconscious panic calculation is, if I throw away my chainsaw, I am no longer a firefighter. And if I'm not a firefighter, who am I in this inferno?
Right. The tools provided a false sense of control, a psychological anchor, even as they physically doomed them.
It is a devastating metaphor for how the human mind operates every single day. Obviously, our listeners aren't, running from literal wildfires.
Hopefully not.
Right. But we all have cognitive tools, ingrained assumptions, habitual ways of solving problems, deeply held political or corporate ideologies that we just refuse to drop, even when the environment around us changes and those tools become a massive liability.
The mechanism driving this is what cognitive psychologists call being a mental miser.
A mental miser.
Yeah, so the human brain consumes roughly 20% of our body's caloric energy, despite being only 2% of our body weight. Thinking is literally calorically expensive.
Oh, that makes sense. So we want to conserve energy.
Exactly. Evolution has wired us to seek cognitive shortcuts. We prefer the frictionless ease of hanging on to an old, familiar worldview over the strenuous, demanding labor of grappling with new evidence.
Because questioning our own beliefs forces us to admit that the facts might have changed, which in turn threatens our identity.
It is the exact same psychological friction as the firefighter refusing to drop the chainsaw. It feels safer to hold on to the heavy, obsolete tool than to step into the unknown empty-handed.
And we see this cognitive miserliness play out in incredibly mundane ways too. Like, most of our listeners are probably familiar with the first instinct fallacy from their school days.
Oh, the multiple choice tests.
Yes. I vividly remember sitting in a gymnasium taking standardized tests, and every teacher and test prep manual preached the exact same gospel. Never change your first answer. Your gut is usually right. If you go back and change it, you'll just overthink it and get it wrong.
It was accepted as absolute dogma in education for decades. I mean, the test prep giant Kaplan actually used to formally warn students in their materials against changing their initial answers.
But the data completely demolishes that myth. The source text points to a massive review of 33 different studies analyzing test-taking behavior. And the overwhelming consensus is that the majority of answer revisions go from wrong to right.
Yeah, and the researchers in Illinois took this a step further and got incredibly granular with it.
This study blew my mind.
Right. They didn't just ask students what they thought, they literally examined the physical eraser marks on 1,500 multiple-choice exams.
They tracked the physical evidence of rethinking.
And what they found was definitive. Only about a quarter of the changes went from a right answer to a wrong one. Half of all the erased and changed answers went from wrong to right.
Wow.
And the remaining quarter were wrong to wrong. So statistically, rethinking your initial instinct doubles your chances of fixing an error.
So why does the myth persist? Like, why do we feel so much anxiety about changing an answer?
It basically comes down to the mechanics of regret and loss aversion.
Okay, how does that work?
Well, the psychological pain of changing a correct answer to a wrong one, that feeling of, I had it right and I ruined it, is exponentially more intense than the mild disappointment of leaving a wrong answer wrong.
Oh, I see. We remember the acute sting of the self-sabotage.
Exactly. So we build a protective superstition around our first instincts to avoid feeling that specific type of regret ever again.
We let the fear of a small regret paralyze our ability to improve. And the crazy thing is, even when you explicitly teach students the statistics of the Illinois eraser mark study, they still hesitate to change their answers on the very next test.
The resistance to unlearning a false narrative is astonishing.
It reminds me of the classic boiling frog anecdote. Everyone in corporate management or self-help has used this at some point.
Oh, right. The premise being that if you drop a frog into a pot of boiling water, it will immediately jump out. But if you place it in a pot of lukewarm water and slowly, gradually turn up the heat, the frog won't notice the change, will complacently sit there, and will eventually boil to death.
It's always used as a metaphor for ignoring gradual threats.
It's a great metaphor, but biologically, it is a complete fabrication.
Totally false.
Yeah.
The sources debunk this beautifully. If you drop a frog into boiling water, the sudden shock and severe tissue damage might actually incapacitate it, preventing it from jumping out.
Right, it would just be paralyzed.
Yeah, but if you put a frog in a pot and slowly heat the water, as soon as the temperature reaches an uncomfortable threshold for the amphibian, it will absolutely jump out.
Because the frog constantly senses its environment, reevaluates the temperature, and drops its previous assumption that the water is safe.
The frog rethinks.
It's highly ironic. The frog actually possesses the sensory flexibility to survive, while humans blindly repeat a false anecdote about the frog's stupidity without ever bothering to fact-check it.
We just accept the narrative because it sounds truthy, and we never rethink it. So if our default setting is to cling to our tools, and if our cognitive laziness prevents us from questioning myths, we have to ask, what are the specific structural ways our minds trap us?
Right, what are the actual mechanisms?
Yeah, what are the mental modes we slip into when our beliefs are challenged? The psychologist Phil Tetlock developed a brilliant framework to explain this.
He did. He argues that when we are thinking and talking, we often slip into the roles of 3 distinct professions without even realizing it.
The preacher, the prosecutor, and the politician.
Let's look at the mechanics of each, because they all represent a different mechanism of intellectual defense.
Okay, let's start with the preacher.
We enter preacher mode when our sacred beliefs are in jeopardy. In this mode, our primary goal is to protect and promote our ideals. We aren't looking for new data or objective truth. We are delivering a sermon to reaffirm our faith and convince others of our righteousness.
So the cognitive monism here is basically confirmation bias on steroids.
Exactly. Then there is prosecutor mode. We shift into this when we spot a flaw in someone else's reasoning.
The entire architecture of our thought process becomes adversarial.
Right. We marshal facts, compile evidence, and cross-examine the other person specifically to prove them wrong and win our case.
We aren't trying to learn from them at all. We're trying to convict them of ignorance.
So the preacher is playing fierce defense for their own beliefs, and the prosecutor is playing aggressive offense against someone else's.
And then we have the third mode, the politician. We utilize this when our primary goal is to win the approval of an audience. We campaign and lobby for the support of our constituents.
And those constituents don't have to be actual voters. It could be your boss, your peer group at a dinner party, or your followers on social media.
Right. When you are in politician mode, you aren't tethered to objective truth either. You are constantly running internal polling, shifting your statements, and adjusting your stance to cater to whatever will generate the most applause or the least friction in that specific room.
The catastrophic danger of all 3 modes is that they completely shut down the rethinking cycle.
Because if you are preaching your own gospel, prosecuting someone else's flaws, or politicking for likes, you have zero cognitive bandwidth left to actually examine your own views.
Exactly. And the source text provides a chilling, real-world example of how these mindsets can destroy even the most highly trained experts. Let's look at the story of Stephen Greenspan.
Oh man, Greenspan's story is almost Shakespearean in its irony.
It really is tragic.
Stephen Greenspan was a clinical professor of psychiatry. He literally wrote the definitive academic book on gullibility.
He spent his entire career analyzing the psychological mechanisms of why people get duped, conned, and scammed.
He was the world's foremost expert on fraud. And yet, almost immediately after publishing his magnum opus on gullibility, Greenspan lost nearly a third of his entire retirement savings by investing in Bernie Madoff's infamous Ponzi scheme.
People assume that highly intelligent, highly educated people are somehow immune to cons. But intelligence is just processing power.
Right, if that processor is running the wrong software, if it's stuck in preacher, prosecutor, or politician mode, it will efficiently process you right off a cliff.
So how did the expert on gullibility fall for the most notorious con in modern financial history? He fell victim to all 3 mindsets.
Let's break it down. How did the preacher mode happen?
Greenspan's sister had been investing in Madoff's fund for a while, and she was seeing consistent, seemingly impossible returns. So she started preaching to her brother about the merits of the fund. Her sermon was emotionally compelling.
Which triggered Greenspan's defense mechanisms when faced with contrary evidence later on.
Exactly. A skeptical friend of Greenspan's looked at the Madoff fund and warned him that the returns defied the laws of the market, that it was too risky.
But instead of evaluating the friend's data objectively, Greenspan shifted into prosecutor mode. He marshaled arguments to tear down his friend's warning, dismissing the friend as an overly cautious, knee-jerk cynic.
He prosecuted the skeptic instead of investigating the fund.
And the final nail in the coffin was the politician mode, right?
Yes. Greenspan made the actual investment through a financial advisor who was a close, well-liked family friend. Greenspan wanted to maintain that relationship and please his friend.
He campaigned for social harmony by agreeing to the investment.
By preaching, prosecuting, and politicking, the world expert on gullibility completely bypassed his own expertise.
So this naturally forces us to define the alternative. If these three modes are our default settings and they lead us to disaster, how do we actively bypass them?
Tetlock and Grant argue that we must adopt a fourth paradigm, the scientist mode.
And to be incredibly clear, operating in scientist mode has absolutely nothing to do with owning a microscope or having a PhD in biochemistry.
No, not at all.
It is entirely about your relationship with your own ideas. In the scientist mode, you do not let your ideas become your identity. You treat your business strategy, your political beliefs, and your life plans as hypotheses.
The defining characteristic of a scientist is that they don't start with the answers, they lead with questions.
They treat their actions as experiments designed to test their hypothesis.
Right. When the data contradicts their theory, a preacher cries heresy, a prosecutor attacks the data's credibility, and a politician spins the data to look like a win.
But a scientist experiences a moment of profound clarity, adjusts their hypothesis, and moves forward.
There is a stunning experiment detailed in the sources that quantifies exactly how much of a financial advantage this scientist mode provides.
Oh, the Italian startup experiment.
Yes. Researchers went to Italy and gathered over 100 founders of early-stage technology startups. They put all of these entrepreneurs through an intensive, months-long training program.
And they divided them into two groups, right?
Exactly. The control group was taught standard, rigorous business strategy. They were taught how to analyze the market, define their value proposition, and execute a business plan.
But the experimental group received a slightly different curriculum. They were taught the exact same business principles, but everything was framed through the lens of the scientific method. They were instructed to put on scientist goggles.
Let's break down the mechanics of what that actually meant for these founders on a Tuesday morning. If a founder in the control group created a prototype, they viewed it as their final product to be sold.
But if a founder in the scientist group created a prototype, they were taught to view it merely as an experiment.
Exactly. When they conducted customer interviews, they weren't trying to sell the customer, they were collecting raw data to test their hypothesis.
The subtle shift in framing changes the entire psychological weight of failure. I mean, if you view your startup as your brilliant masterstroke, a customer rejecting it is a personal attack. You get defensive.
Right. But if your startup is just a hypothesis, a customer rejecting it is just a data point, proving the hypothesis null. You don't get defensive, you get curious.
And the financial results of this experiment are staggering. Over the following year, the startups in the control group, the ones taught standard business execution, averaged under $300 in revenue.
They basically flatlined.
But the group taught to view their companies through scientist goggles. They averaged over $12,000 in revenue.
That's a massive difference.
Furthermore, they brought in that revenue more than twice as fast as the control group.
The mechanism driving that massive discrepancy in revenue is cognitive flexibility. When the market didn't respond favorably, the founders in the control group got wedded to their original, failing ideas.
They preached the virtues of their product, they prosecuted the customers for not getting it, and they politicked to appease their initial investors.
They held onto their heavy chainsaws while the fire closed in.
But the scientist group, they pivoted more than twice as often. When the data told them their hypothesis was wrong, they dropped their tools without any ego damage, formulated a new hypothesis, and built something the market actually wanted.
Which scales up to one of the most famous corporate cautionary tales of the last 2 decades. The fall of BlackBerry and the rise of Apple.
Right. Mike Lazaridis was undeniably a genius. He invented the BlackBerry, and when he was building it, he was the ultimate scientist.
He was constantly running experiments. He hypothesized that people wouldn't want to type long emails on a tiny device, so he experimented with routing emails through secure servers to deliver them instantly.
He hypothesized about the biomechanics of using thumbs instead of fingers to type. He tested, he iterated, and he revolutionized global communication.
But as BlackBerry exploded and Lazaridis became a wildly successful CEO, his cognitive mode shifted. He abandoned the scientist goggles.
He became a preacher and a politician.
Yes. By 2007, the landscape shifted violently when Steve Jobs introduced the iPhone. It featured a fully functional internet browser and, most crucially, a glass touchscreen with no physical keyboard.
And how did Lazaridis react to this new data point? He didn't run an experiment to see if users liked touchscreens. He preached. He declared that people only wanted mobile phones for work emails, not for home entertainment.
He prosecuted Apple's battery life and security.
Even in 2012, long after it was glaringly obvious that the iPhone had fundamentally changed human behavior, Lazaridis was still holding onto his chainsaw.
Apple had captured a massive share of the global market, and Lazaridis was in board meetings pointing at touchscreen devices and saying, "I don't get this."
He was playing the politician, catering solely to his existing base of corporate users who loved physical keyboards, while completely ignoring the billions of new consumers who wanted a computer in their pocket.
Now, what's fascinating is to contrast Lazaridis' rigidity with Steve Jobs' evolution during that exact same period.
This is such a great story.
The popular mythology of Steve Jobs is that he was a dictatorial visionary who never listened to anyone and forced his singular will upon the world. But the historical reality of the iPhone's creation reveals a profound moment of rethinking.
Jobs actually hated the idea of a cell phone.
He despised them. Before 2004, Jobs swore Apple would never make a phone. He threw actual tantrums about the idea of dealing with the rigid, bureaucratic cell phone carriers.
He felt cell phones were clunky and fundamentally un-Apple. He used to physically smash his own cell phones in frustration. So how did the man who vehemently swore he would never make a phone end up creating the most iconic phone in history?
His engineers didn't give up, but more importantly, they didn't prosecute him. If they had attacked his intelligence or told him he was wrong, Jobs would have dug in his heels.
So what did they do?
Instead, his team approached him with a strategy that activated his inner scientist. They recognized his resistance, so they reframed the data. They showed him that building a phone didn't mean abandoning Apple's identity as a pristine computing company.
They pointed out that they could simply take the iPod, which was wildly successful and which Jobs deeply loved, and add communication technology to it.
Exactly. They didn't pitch a phone, they pitched a better iPod.
They complexified the problem for him. And Jobs, despite his legendary stubbornness, possessed enough cognitive flexibility to recognize a superior hypothesis when he saw one.
He dropped his anti-phone tools, rethought his stance, and initiated a project that made Apple the most valuable company in human history.
The contrast between Lazaridis and Jobs highlights a terrifying reality about human intelligence. Being smart does not make you immune to bad ideas.
In fact, high intelligence can actually be weaponized against the truth if you aren't careful.
This is one of the most unsettling concepts in the research. We assume that if we just educate people more, if we just give them more analytical skills, they will arrive at the objective truth.
But there is a study detailing how mathematical geniuses process political data that shatters this assumption.
The mechanics of this study are brilliant. Researchers gathered a group of adults with varying levels of mathematical ability. They gave them a complex data set to analyze.
The data required them to look at patterns and determine if a specific intervention was successful or not.
In the first round, the researchers labeled the data as being about a new medical treatment for skin rashes. And exactly as you would expect, the people with high mathematical ability did a fantastic job.
Their fast processors crunched the numbers correctly, and they accurately determined whether the rash cream worked.
But then, the researchers ran the exact same experiment. They used the exact same numbers, the exact same statistical patterns, but they changed the labels on the data.
Instead of being about a neutral topic like skin rashes, the data was labeled as being about a highly polarizing ideological issue.
And as hosts, we aren't endorsing any specific political viewpoint here, but we are reporting on the data. The topic was the effectiveness of gun control laws in a specific city.
And the results completely inverted. When the math whizzes were handed data that contradicted their pre-existing political ideology, whether they were conservative or liberal, their analytical skills didn't just fail, they actively betrayed them.
The people with the highest mathematical ability actually performed worse at analyzing the patterns than people with lower math skills.
The mechanism at play here is called motivated reasoning, fueled by high cognitive capacity. If you have low math skills, you might just get confused by the data.
But if you have high math skills and the data threatens your identity, you use your massive processing power to hunt for obscure loopholes, manipulate the statistics, and build an impenetrable, mathematically complex fortress around your false belief.
The better you are at crunching numbers, the more spectacularly you fail when the numbers threaten your dogma. You aren't using your intelligence as a scientist to find the truth. You are using it as an elite prosecutor to destroy the threatening data.
Which means we are all wandering around completely blind to our own biases, convinced that our intelligence is protecting us when it's actually digging the trench deeper.
To understand how completely divorced our confidence can be from our actual competence, we need to look at a bizarre medical condition from the late 19th century.
You're talking about Anton syndrome.
Yes. There was a seamstress in the 1800s named Ursula Merks. Due to a stroke or brain trauma, she went completely, irreversibly blind.
But the shocking part wasn't her blindness. It was that she had absolutely no idea she was blind.
Anton syndrome is a rare neurological condition caused by damage to the brain's occipital lobe. The patient loses their vision, but the area of the brain responsible for recognizing that loss is also damaged.
So the brain simply confabulates. It invents visual information.
Exactly.
When Ursula's doctor would hold up a pocket watch and ask her what he was holding, she wouldn't look toward it. She would blindly reach out her hands, fumbling in the air to touch it, all while calmly and confidently insisting that she could see it perfectly well.
She was quite literally mentally blind to her own blindness.
While Anton syndrome is a rare physical trauma, it serves as the perfect analogy for our everyday cognitive state. We all suffer from a psychological version of Anton syndrome.
We are utterly blind to our own cognitive blind spots.
Most of our listeners are probably familiar with the Dunning-Kruger effect, which maps this exact phenomenon. It's a concept that the least confident people are often the most confident.
David Dunning and Justin Kruger won the satirical Ig Nobel Prize for their research, but the underlying mechanics are profoundly important.
Right. They found that people who score in the lowest percentiles on tests of logical reasoning, grammar, and even a sense of humor consistently and wildly overestimate how well they performed.
And what Grant's sources reveal that isn't commonly talked about is the specific mechanism of why this happens. It's a deficit in metacognition.
Which is the ability to think about your own thinking.
Precisely. To realize you are terrible at grammar, you have to possess a basic understanding of the rules of grammar. Lacking the skills to achieve excellence inherently means you also lack the skills to judge excellence. The blindness masks the blindness.
Which leads people directly to the summit of what psychologists jokingly call Mount Stupid.
The researchers ran a fascinating simulation where regular people were asked to play the role of doctors managing a fictional zombie apocalypse.
Oh, right. The progression of their confidence is the key takeaway here.
Yeah.
When they first started the simulation, they knew nothing, and their confidence was appropriately low. They were cautious.
But the moment they gained just a tiny sliver of experience, the moment they successfully managed one minor crisis in the simulation, their confidence skyrocketed vertically.
They suddenly believed they were master epidemiologists. They climbed Mount Stupid. They had acquired just enough knowledge to recognize the landscape, but nowhere near enough knowledge to recognize the devastating pitfalls.
We see this psychological Anton syndrome play out on the world stage with terrifying consequences. Take the 2016 presidential election in Iceland.
It featured two candidates who perfectly represent the extreme poles of the confidence-competence spectrum. On one side, you had David Oddsson.
Oddsson is the ultimate armchair quarterback. He was the former prime minister and the governor of the Central Bank of Iceland.
During his tenure, he deregulated the banking sector and allowed the bank's balance sheets to balloon to 10 times the size of Iceland's entire national GDP.
When the 2008 financial crisis hit, Iceland's economy completely imploded. Time magazine literally named Oddsson as one of the 25 people globally responsible for the financial crash.
And here is the kicker regarding his competence. He had absolutely zero formal training in finance or economics. He was a former comedian and a journalist before entering politics.
Yet, just a few years after piloting the national economy into a mountain, he confidently announced his candidacy for the presidency of Iceland, stating to the press that his experience and knowledge would be highly beneficial to the office.
His confidence wildly, conically exceeded his competence. He was blind to his blindness.
On the absolute opposite end of the spectrum in that same election, you had Halla Tomasdóttir. She was an incredibly successful financial executive.
She had actually co-founded an investment firm and successfully steered it through the worst carnage of the very financial crisis that Oddsson helped create. She had immense proven competence.
But when a grassroots movement petitioned her to run for president, Her reaction wasn't confidence. She was hit with a massive, paralyzing wave of imposter syndrome.
Her competence wildly exceeded her confidence. She literally felt a pit in her stomach and spent days agonizing, asking her friends, "Who am I to be president?"
Now, in modern corporate culture, we tend to view imposter syndrome as a crippling disease that must be eradicated. We tell people to fake it till you make it and project unshakable confidence.
But let me push back on that, because on some level, doesn't imposter syndrome paralyze you? I mean, Hala almost didn't enter the race because she felt so inadequate. If you're constantly doubting your abilities, you never take the shot.
It absolutely can be paralyzing if it metastasizes into debilitating anxiety or clinical depression. But if we look at the mechanics of moderate, healthy imposter syndrome, it is actually an incredibly productive engine for growth.
So,
Because the person on Mount Stupid feels no need to prepare, they know it all. But Hala Tomastodier, precisely because she doubted her tools, went into overdrive to prepare.
she utilized her uncertainty.
Yes, she asked everyone around her for advice. She listened to voters instead of preaching to them. Her imposter syndrome kept her ego in check and kept her strictly in scientist mode.
She was constantly running experiments to test her viability as a candidate.
And because of that relentless learning, she surged from less than 1% in the early polls to becoming a major, formidable contender in the final vote.
So she managed to find the exact midpoint between the arrogant armchair quarterback and the paralyzed imposter. She achieved what the sources call confident humility.
That is the sweet spot of cognitive flexibility. Confident humility is a delicate balance. It means having absolute faith in your ultimate capability to achieve a goal in the future, while maintaining the rigorous humility to question whether you are using the right tools, strategies, or methods in the present.
I love that mechanical distinction. Believing in your capability but doubting your tools.
Yeah.
Once you internalize that confident humility, a truly bizarre psychological transformation takes place.
Finding out that you are wrong stops being a humiliating blow to your ego, and it actually becomes a source of genuine joy.
I know that sounds deeply paradoxical to a lot of listeners. How can the friction of being proven wrong ever be joyful?
We have to look at the Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman. The author of the source text tells a story about giving a presentation to a group of eminent academics.
He presented data showing that givers, people who are inherently generous with their time and resources in the workplace, tend to have higher rates of professional failure. But simultaneously, they also have higher rates of extreme success.
Kahneman, who is one of the most brilliant psychologists in history, approached him after the talk. Kahneman wasn't defensive, his eyes were lit up, and he was absolutely thrilled that his own previous intuitions on the subject had just been proven wrong by this new data.
Kahneman's superpower isn't just his intellect, it is his total detachment. He refuses to allow his scientific beliefs to fuse with his personal identity. As Kahneman himself has noted, his attachment to his ideas is purely provisional.
To achieve that joy of being wrong, the research dictates that we have to practice two specific types of detachment. The first is detaching your present self from your past self.
There's a fantastic quote from the billionaire investor Ray Dalio that perfectly captures this mechanism. If you don't look back at yourself and think, wow, how stupid I was a year ago, you haven't learned much.
That requires a fundamental shift in how you view your own timeline. You have to stop viewing your intelligence as a fixed, static monument and start viewing your life as a constant, iterative evolution.
The person you were a year ago was operating with less data. Of course they made worse decisions. Forgiving your past self allows you to update your present self.
And the second type of detachment is even more difficult. You must detach your opinions from your identity. You have to anchor your identity to your core values, not to the specific methods or opinions you currently hold.
Because methods and opinions constantly become obsolete as new data emerges. The book uses a dark but hilarious analogy for this. Imagine going to a doctor and you look at their medical license on the wall, and it says their core identity is professional lobotomist.
Or a police chief who defines their entire identity by the specific tactic of stop and frisk.
Right. Decades ago, those were considered standard, even cutting-edge practices in their fields. But if those professionals fuse their identity to the tool, if the doctor is a lobotomist, then they will violently resist any new neurological research that suggests lobotomies are barbaric.
Dropping the tool destroys their identity, but if the doctor detaches their identity from the tool and anchors it to their core value, which is protecting patient health, then they can easily and joyfully throw the lobotomy tools in the trash the moment better science arrives.
This detachment is the exact operational framework of superforecasters. The Good Judgment Project runs massive forecasting tournaments where thousands of people try to predict complex global events like election outcomes, economic shifts, or military movements.
A super forecasters, the people who consistently win these tournaments and beat intelligence agencies, do not possess magical intuition.
They aren't psychics.
Not at all. Their secret is that they are constantly, ruthlessly updating their predictions. They treat their initial opinions as loose hunches, not as gospel truth.
When new geopolitical data drops, they don't defend their old forecast. They adjust it incrementally. They are entirely detached from their previous answers.
Okay, so logically, we know we need to detach our egos, and we know we need confident humility. But practically speaking, how do we actively uncover our blind spots before we crash the car?
Because we just established that we suffer from psychological Anton syndrome, we can't see our own blindness. How do we pressure test our ideas?
You cannot do it alone. You have to build what organizational psychologists call a challenge network. In our culture, we are constantly advised to build a support network. We want friends, mentors, and cheerleaders who validate our feelings, agree with our choices, and lift us up when we are down.
And for emotional stability, a support network is vital. But for cognitive growth, it is useless. A challenge network is a carefully curated group of highly disagreeable people whom you respect, specifically empowered to point out the flaws in your logic.
We spend our entire lives running away from disagreeable people.
Yes, because they create friction. But they are essential because they don't care about politicking. They aren't trying to appease you or manage your feelings. They care intensely about the task at hand and the objective truth.
The ultimate example of deploying a challenge network involves Brad Bird, the visionary Oscar-winning animation director. When he was brought into Pixar to direct The Incredibles, the studio executives were terrified.
The script Bird had written was insanely complex. It required animating human hair, water, and fire on a scale Pixar had never attempted. The projection said it would take 10 years and cost hundreds of millions of dollars to make.
So what did Bird do? He didn't assemble a team of agreeable, easygoing animators who would just nod and follow the standard Pixar operating procedures.
He did the exact opposite. He walked around the studio and actively recruited all the black sheep. He gathered the malcontents, the cynics, the artists who were deeply frustrated with the status quo, the people who were constantly arguing with management about the limitations of the software.
He intentionally built a challenge network of disagreeable people.
And the result of bringing all that friction into one room. Because those artists were fearless about questioning the established tools and methods, they invented entirely new animation software and workflows. They delivered a cinematic masterpiece, and they did it on time and under budget.
But I can hear our listeners thinking, if I put a dozen highly disagreeable, angry people in a room, it's just going to devolve into a toxic screaming match.
Right, and this highlights a crucial mechanical distinction in the research between two different types of conflict: task conflict and relationship conflict.
This distinction is everything. Relationship conflict is destructive, it is deeply personal, it is emotional, and it is fueled by animosity and disrespect. You are an idiot, and I hate working with you.
When relationship conflict flares up, the amygdala fires, everyone puts up their defensive shields, and rethinking completely shuts down.
But task conflict is incredibly productive. It is about the work, the ideas, and the data. Your methodology in this spreadsheet is flawed, and here's the data to prove it. It brings a diversity of thought and physically prevents a group from falling into an overconfidence cycle.
You look at historical innovators like the Wright brothers. By all accounts, Orville and Wilbur argued incessantly. They yelled, they slammed doors, they fought for hours. But it wasn't relationship conflict. It was intense, productive task conflict. They were attacking the aerodynamics, not each other.
But the million-dollar question is, how do you prevent task conflict from devolving into relationship conflict? How do you keep the debate focused on the data without bruising someone's ego?
The research provides a massive actionable tool for this. You have to force the argument to be about how a W, not WHY.
Let's really drill down into the mechanics of that. I imagine that asking someone why they believe something feels like a direct interrogation of their core values, which makes them defensive, whereas asking them how it works forces them into a mechanical, problem-solving mindset.
That is exactly the cognitive shift that occurs. When you ask people why they believe a certain political policy is right, they tend to double down on their convictions. They shift immediately into preacher mode. delivering a sermon about their moral righteousness.
But when you bypass the why and ask them to explain, step by step, how that exact policy would actually be implemented in the real world, how the funding would be raised, how the bureaucracy would manage it, how the secondary effects would be mitigated, it activates a rethinking cycle.
It exposes what psychologists refer to as the illusion of explanatory depth.
Yes. We all walk around in a state of mild delusion, believing we understand the complex mechanisms of the world much better than we actually do.
If I stop you on the street and ask if you know how a bicycle works, or how a piano key generates a sound, or how a zipper functions, you will likely say yes, feeling very confident.
But the moment I hand you a piece of paper and ask you to draw the exact physical mechanics of the bicycle chain and gears, you suddenly realize you have absolutely no idea.
It is instantly, brutally humbling.
And that humility is the key. When the Wright brothers were stuck in a screaming match about the design of an airplane propeller, they were originally arguing about why their respective theories were right. It was getting personal.
But when they shifted the argument to drawing out exactly how the air would flow over the specific mechanical curve of the propeller blade, they both discovered the limits of their own knowledge.
The illusion of explanatory depth was shattered. They humbled themselves, dropped their egos, and collaboratively solved the puzzle.
Realizing your own blind spots and navigating task conflict is only half the battle, because what happens when you've done all the work, you are fully operating in scientist mode. But the person sitting across the table from you, your boss, your spouse, your political rival, is stubbornly locked in prosecutor mode.
All your self-awareness is completely useless if you don't know the mechanical techniques to disarm them.
Which brings us to the science of interpersonal rethinking. How do we actually persuade someone who is dug into a trench?
And the science of persuasion goes against almost everything we have been taught in Debate Club. We need to examine the story of Harish Natarajan. Harish is an international debate champion. And in a highly publicized event, he was brought in to debate an IBM supercomputer known as Project Debater.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's look at the staggering asymmetry of this matchup. Project Debater wasn't just pulling up Wikipedia articles. It was utilizing advanced semantic analysis algorithms to instantly mine a corpus of over 10 billion sentences from academic papers, news articles, and governmental reports.
It could construct complex, statistically backed arguments in milliseconds.
The topic was whether preschools should be heavily subsidized by the government. The supercomputer goes first, and it unleashes a flawless barrage of data, citing dozens of studies showing the long-term societal benefits of early childhood education. It builds a massive fortress of facts.
Now, human instinct, when faced with an overwhelming opposing argument, is to build a counterfortress. We marshal every single defensive point we can think of, and we attack the opponent's weakest points.
We create a straw man, taking the flimsiest version of their argument and tearing it down to make ourselves look stronger.
But Harish, despite facing 10 billion sentences of data, didn't do that. He utilized a technique known as steel manning.
Explain the cognitive friction of steel manning. What does it actually do to an audience?
Steel manning is the intentional practice of articulating the absolute strongest possible version of your opponent's argument. Harish stood up and actually conceded several of the computer's most powerful points. He openly agreed that poverty is a massive systemic issue and that early education is vital.
The cognitive friction here is profound. When an audience or an opponent hears you validate their strongest points, their amygdala deactivates, their defensive shields drop.
By steel manning, Harish signaled that he was not a prosecutor out for blood. He was a scientist seeking the objective truth alongside them.
And once he disarmed the audience by conceding the computer's strong points, he didn't counterattack with a laundry list of 20 different reasons why subsidies were bad. He focused on just two incredibly well-developed points about the specific economics of the subsidies favoring the middle class over the poor.
And Harish won the debate. A human beat a supercomputer with 10 billion data points by conceding ground and using fewer arguments.
The fact that he used fewer arguments is a critical mechanism in persuasion. There's a fascinating experiment regarding university alumni donations that perfectly illustrates the danger of argument dilution. Researchers tested two different psychological pitches to persuade resistant alumni to donate money.
The first pitch emphasized the altruistic impact. Donating will do tangible good for the students and the faculty. The second pitch emphasized the personal, emotional benefit. Donating will give you a warm glow and make you feel good about yourself.
Both of those are solid, valid arguments on their own.
But the researchers decided to combine them. They pitched a group of alumni using both reasons, doing good, A and D feeling good, and the results were totally counterintuitive. The combined pitch was significantly less effective at generating donations than using either of the single arguments alone.
Why? Because of the prosecutor mindset. If someone is already skeptical or resistant to giving you money, their brain is actively looking for a flaw in your logic. If you pile on a long list of justifications, you are inevitably going to include a weaker argument alongside your strong ones.
You are giving the prosecutor more surface area to attack. They only need to find one weak link in your chain of arguments to dismiss your entire case. If they think, I don't care about a warm glow, they throw out the whole pitch. A cohesive, small number of highly fortified arguments is exponentially more persuasive than a scattershot list.
Another deeply counterintuitive tactic Harris used, and that the research supports, is the immense power of weak opinions. We're conditioned to believe that to persuade someone, we have to project absolute, unwavering certainty. If you show doubt, you show weakness.
But the data on expert witnesses in courtrooms demolishes that myth. Studies show that when highly credentialed expert witnesses express absolute 100% certainty on the stand, juries often find them less credible. They sense the arrogance.
But when an expert witness expresses moderate confidence, when they admit a slight margin of error or acknowledge the limitations of the data, juries find them significantly more persuasive.
Because it signals confident humility. Admitting uncertainty proves you aren't a fanatic preacher. It proves you are a trustworthy scientist. It invites the jury's curiosity rather than triggering their defensiveness.
Okay, but what happens when you apply all these techniques? Steel manning, limiting your arguments, expressing confident humility, and the person across the table is just openly hostile? What if they are totally dug in, utterly dogmatic, and refuse to listen to any facts whatsoever?
This is where we have to abandon debating entirely and shift into a psychological framework known as motivational interviewing. This technique was pioneered by clinical psychologists William Miller and Stephen Rolnick, and its origins are actually in treating severe addiction.
The core foundational premise of motivational interviewing is a hard truth. You cannot force a human being to change their mind. You cannot mandate a paradigm shift. If you push, they will pull. Your only option is to help them locate their own internal motivation to change.
Let me use a mechanical analogy here. Trying to debate a hostile person by bombarding them with facts is like trying to drive a manual transmission car and just slamming your foot on the gas without using the clutch. The engine is just going to violently stall.
Motivational interviewing is about finding the friction point on the clutch. You have to listen to the engine and ease into the gear they are already subtly shifting toward.
That is a brilliant analogy because in motivational interviewing, the psychologist acts strictly as a guide, never as a leader or a prosecutor. When someone is contemplating a change, even if they seem fiercely resistant, they almost always exhibit internal ambivalence. They have some reasons to maintain their current destructive behavior, and maybe one tiny hidden reason they want to change.
The terminology used here is sustained talk versus change talk. Sustained talk is all the commentary defending the status quo. I don't have a drinking problem, I just like to unwind. Change talk is any subtle reference, however small, to a desire or ability to make an adjustment. I mean, the hangovers are starting to affect my work, but I'm fine.
Your job as the guide is to ignore the sustained talk and gently amplify the change talk using open-ended questions. If a manager is dealing with a toxic employee who refuses to change their behavior, instead of prosecuting them and saying, "You are a terrible team player," you ask, "What does ideal teamwork look like to you? Are there any leaders you admire?"
You force them to articulate the ideal state, and then you let them recognize the gap between their own behavior and their ideal state.
You let them discover the discrepancy themselves. And the ultimate tool in this process is the quintessential scientist question. What evidence would it take to change your mind?
If you ask a dogmatic person that question, and they look you in the eye and say, absolutely nothing, then your job is done. You walk away. You can lead a horse to water, but you cannot make it think. If their mental ecosystem is entirely closed off to new data, any further engagement is just a waste of your caloric energy.
This nuanced, one-on-one persuasion is incredibly powerful. But we have to scale this up. We live in a society that currently feels totally irreconcilably fractured. The political and social polarization is deafening. How do we apply these mechanisms to the massive, deeply charged issues that are tearing communities apart?
To understand collective rethinking, we need to look at the Difficult Conversations Lab at Columbia University, run by psychologist Peter Coleman. Coleman literally locks groups of people with vehemently opposing, deeply entrenched political views into a room together, gives them a highly contentious issue, and asks them to reach a consensus.
It sounds like the premise for a deeply stressful reality television show.
It does. But Coleman has spent years analyzing the audio and psychological data from these locked room debates, and he found a way to actually engineer productive dialogue. He identified that the primary enemy in these societal debates is a cognitive mechanism called binary bias.
Binary bias is the human brain's relentless desire for cognitive ease. Complex issues require massive caloric energy to process. So, to save energy, our brains take incredibly nuanced, multidimensional spectrums and brutally flatten them into a simple two-sided coin. Black and white, good and evil, left and right. We erase all the nuance because nuance is exhausting.
So, how did Coleman break the binary bias in the lab? He introduced a concept called complexifying the issue. Before he put the participants in the room to debate gun control, he gave them an article to read to prime their cognitive state.
And the specific framing of that article dictated the entire outcome of the experiment. When he gave participants an article written like a lawyer's opening statement, where the author fiercely argued for one extreme side and aggressively attacked the other, the ensuing conversations in the lab were completely toxic. They were hostile, dogmatic, and totally unproductive.
But when he took those exact same polarized participants and gave them an article written like an anthropologist's field notes, an article that highlighted the many interrelated dilemmas, acknowledged the valid concerns of multiple stakeholders, and exposed the messy gray areas of the issue, the result was entirely different.
Primed by the complexity, these deeply polarized individuals engaged in dramatically better, more respectful, and more intellectually flexible conversations.
The mechanism here is that by exposing them to the complexity, he disrupted the overconfidence cycle. It's very easy to be absolutely certain of your stance when you view the issue as a simple coin toss, but it's impossible to maintain that arrogant certainty when you are forced to view the issue as a complex prism with dozens of refractions and unintended consequences.
What's fascinating about this study isn't the specific politics of gun control, it's that whether the participant was a staunch conservative or a staunch progressive, the exact same psychological breakdown occurred when they read the lawyer's argument, and the exact same breakthrough occurred when they read the anthropologist's field notes.
And as hosts, we aren't endorsing any specific political viewpoint here, but we are reporting that acknowledging the complexity of these issues is scientifically proven to reduce hostility and foster actual dialogue. The data proves that acknowledging the inherent complexity of an issue doesn't mean you are abandoning your moral principles. It means you are abandoning emotional simplicity.
Coleman noted that the unproductive, toxic conversations featured a very limited emotional bandwidth, mostly just anger and frustration. But the productive conversations featured a complex, shifting range of emotions. Frustration, yes, but also curiosity, hesitation, and moments of shared humor.
So, if complexifying issues is the scientifically proven cure for dogmatic polarization, how do we operationalize this? How do we build structural environments in our schools and in our corporations that actually mandate this kind of cognitive flexibility?
We have to actively build cultures of lifelong learners, and the foundation of that starts in early education. There is a beautiful, profound story in the source material about an elementary school teacher named Ron Berger and an exercise known as Austin's butterfly.
Austin was a first-grade student who was assigned to draw a scientific illustration of a butterfly from a photograph. Now, Austin is 6 years old. His first draft looked exactly like you would expect a 6-year-old's drawing to look. It was a bit messy, the proportions were wrong, and it looked more like a lopsided moth than the specific species in the photo.
In a standard traditional classroom, a teacher might slap a gold star on it, say, "Great job, Austin," to protect his self-esteem, or perhaps mark it up with a red pen and move on to the next subject.
But Berger utilized a completely different pedagogical mechanism. He gathered the entire first-grade class around Austin's drawing, and he facilitated a session of highly specific constructive task conflict. He asked the children what they observed. They noted that the wings in the photo were sharper, or that the pattern on the paper didn't match the real butterfly.
Crucially, they weren't criticizing Austin, they were analyzing the mechanics of the drawing. Armed with this data, Austin went back to his desk and drew a second draft. Then the class did another round of critique. He drew a third draft. By the time Austin reached his sixth draft, the drawing was astonishing. It looked like it had been rendered by a professional adult illustrator.
The psychological resilience built by this exercise is immense. What Berger's process teaches a 6-year-old brain is that perfection is never expected on the first attempt. It completely normalizes the state of being a work in progress. It teaches children that revision, the act of rethinking and redrawing your mental models based on new data, is not a humiliating punishment. It is a joyful, elaborative process of discovery.
It is the absolute antithesis of the traditional lecture model we use in most high schools and universities. And there is data showing why we are so addicted to lectures, despite them being less effective.
We suffer from the illusion of fluency. When a brilliant professor stands at a podium and smoothly, eloquently delivers a perfectly structured lecture, the students listening experience cognitive ease. Because the delivery of the information is smooth, the students falsely assume that their understanding of the information is also smooth.
But when you test those students against classrooms that use active learning, where students are forced to grapple with the material, argue about it, and solve problems in real time, the active learning students score significantly higher. Active learning feels clunky and frustrating in the moment because it forces the brain to expend caloric energy to rethink. But that exact friction is what brings the knowledge into long-term memory.
We see the exact same critical need for rethinking cultures in the high-stakes environments of the corporate and governmental world. And the ultimate case study for this is NASA.
Historically, NASA was revered as the ultimate performance culture. During the Apollo era, their core organizational value was flawless execution. They were doing things that had never been done in human history, so they relied heavily on rigorous standard operating procedures.
But a strict performance culture harbors a dark psychological flaw. It breeds systemic overconfidence. When your entire identity is based on executing the plan flawlessly, you become terrified of pointing out anomalies that might halt the execution. That performance-driven overconfidence directly contributed to the tragic space shuttle disasters, both the Challenger and the Columbia.
In both instances, lower-level engineers saw data that troubled them, O-ring damage in cold weather or foam strikes on the wing. But because the culture punished delays and demanded absolute proof before stopping a launch, the engineers couldn't override the management's momentum. They lacked what organizational psychologist Amy Edmondson calls psychological safety.
In a true learning culture, growth, not flawless execution, is the core value. Psychological safety is the bedrock of a learning culture. It means that any employee, regardless of their rank, must feel completely secure that they can raise a red flag, challenge a deeply held assumption, or propose a wildly unorthodox experiment without facing any professional punishment, humiliation, or retaliation.
But let me push back on this, because this sounds great in an academic textbook, but in the real world, Wall Street measures outcomes. If I am the CEO of a publicly traded company and I cultivate total psychological safety where everyone is constantly experimenting and challenging the status quo, how do I maintain any operational accountability? If my team runs a great learning experiment that loses $10 million, the board is going to fire me. How does a learning culture survive real-world financial pressure?
That is the most common and vital executive pushback. The solution lies in fundamentally redefining what you are holding people accountable for. In a toxic performance culture, you have outcome accountability. You judge an employee entirely by the final financial result.
Right. Did you hit your quarterly quota or not?
Exactly. But in a learning culture, you implement process accountability. You rigorously evaluate the methodology of how the decision was made, regardless of the final outcome. Think about the mechanics of probability. A team can use a terrible, lazy, biased process, but through sheer dumb luck, the market shifts and they make $1 million. If you use outcome accountability, you reward them, thereby incentivizing terrible processes.
Conversely, a team can run a flawless, data-driven, scientifically rigorous experiment, and due to an unforeseeable black swan event, they lose money.
If you punish them for the bad outcome, you destroy their willingness to ever take a calculated risk again.
Precisely. A bad process with a good outcome is just luck. A good process with a bad outcome is a smart experiment.
Sure.
Process accountability ensures that people are rewarded for operating in scientist mode, analyzing data objectively, and maintaining confident humility.
It reminds me of the famous Amazon leadership principle, disagree and commit. You don't need to demand absolute guaranteed proof that an idea will succeed before you try it. You require a rigorous, defensible process, but you accept that the outcome is fundamentally uncertain. You gamble on a well-thought-out bet, and if it fails, you analyze the data and pivot without ego.
So we have traced the mechanics of rethinking from the side of a burning mountain through our own internal biases into our interpersonal debates and all the way up to organizational architecture.
But to bring this deep dive to a close, we need to aim this analytical lens directly inward, at the architecture of our own individual lives. We need to examine how we plan our futures and how we routinely trap ourselves in existential tunnel vision.
And the root of this tunnel vision often begins with the most innocent, well-intentioned question we ask children: what do you want to be when you grow up?
I was asked that constantly. Are you going to be a fireman, a doctor, an astronaut? It seems entirely harmless. It's just a way to spark a child's imagination. But the source material highlights that repeatedly asking this question forces the developing brain into a psychological trap called identity foreclosure.
Identity foreclosure occurs when a person locks into a specific, rigid vision of their future self far too early in their development. By declaring, "I am going to be a lawyer," you close off the exploration of dozens of other potential paths before you have even gathered any data on what those paths entail.
You arrive at college as a freshman, declare a pre-law major, and stubbornly stick to it, even if you find the actual coursework incredibly tedious and soul-crushing, simply because you foreclosed on that identity when you were 16.
And identity foreclosure leads directly into one of the most destructive cognitive biases in behavioral economics: the escalation of commitment, also known as the sunk cost fallacy. This is the mechanism where we sink more time, more money, and more emotional bandwidth into a clearly failing plan, simply because we cannot bear to admit that our past investment was a waste.
We rationalize our past bad decisions to protect our current ego. We see this mechanism destroy companies that pour millions of additional R&D dollars into a failing product. We see it in people who stay in toxic, miserable relationships for years just because they already put 5 years into it. And we see it profoundly in career paths. People will endure decades of misery in a profession because the psychological cost of dropping their specialized tools feels insurmountable.
There is a deeply moving narrative in the text about a man named Ryan Grant that illustrates how painful yet necessary rethinking a career can be. Grant was driven. He went through the grueling, decade-long crucible of medical school and residency to become a neurosurgeon. He achieved the ultimate goal he had foreclosed on.
But once he was actually practicing, he looked around and realized that the daily mechanical life of a surgeon operating on one patient at a time wasn't allowing him to make the broad systemic impact on the healthcare bureaucracy that he actually cared about.
For the vast majority of people, that realization would instantly trigger the escalation of commitment. The internal monologue would be, "I spent 10 years of my youth, went hundreds of thousands of dollars into debt, and endured sleepless nights to become a surgeon. I have to be a surgeon. I can't throw all that away."
But Grant managed to override that bias. He initiated a rethinking cycle. He realized that the surgical tools he fought so hard to acquire were no longer the right tools for the problem he wanted to solve. He made the agonizing choice to step away from the operating table to found a healthcare startup aimed at systemic change. He dropped his chainsaw.
To prevent ourselves from falling victim to the sunk cost fallacy, the experts recommend instituting a regular career checkup. Think about it mechanically. You go to the dentist every 6 months to check for cavities. You change the oil in your car every few thousand miles, but we rarely schedule deliberate time to diagnostically examine our life choices.
You should not wait until you are experiencing total burnout, clinical depression, or midlife crisis to ask if your current trajectory still aligns with your evolving values.
It ties all the way back to Daniel Kahneman and the joy of being wrong. You have to detach your present self from your past self. The things that fascinated you at 22 might completely bore you at 35. The tools that made you successful in your last job might be the exact tools holding you back in your current one. And acknowledging that shift is not a failure. It is the definition of growth.
Passions are not hidden treasures waiting to be discovered under a rock. Passions are developed through iterative experimentation. Our identities are not fixed monuments. They are open, dynamic systems. We are fully allowed to revise the blueprints of our lives exactly the same way Austin revised his drawing of the butterfly.
If we pull back and look at the immense, complex terrain we've navigated over the last hour, a clear diagnostic picture emerges. We started on a terrifying burning hillside in Man Gulch, learning that the biological urge to cling to our familiar tools can literally kill us.
We examined how the preacher, the prosecutor, and the politician mindsets weaponize our own intelligence against the truth, and how adopting the scientist's goggles can multiply a startup's revenue.
We explored the neurological blindness of Anton syndrome, the arrogance of the armchair quarterback, and how embracing a healthy dose of imposter syndrome allows us to achieve the sweet spot of confident humility.
We learned the mechanical secrets of persuasion from a debate champion who beat a supercomputer by conceding ground. We saw how asking how instead of why humbles the ego, and how complexifying an issue can break the fever of political polarization.
And ultimately, we uncovered that whether you are designing a first-grade curriculum, attempting to fix a broken corporate culture, or agonizing over a massive career pivot, the ability to unlearn, to actively, joyfully rethink is the ultimate cognitive superpower in a rapidly changing world.
So, as you leave the laboratory today, I want to leave you with one final, deeply provocative challenge, drawn directly from the core of this source material. I want you to think of a deeply held conviction you are carrying right now. It could be your belief about a chosen career path, a judgment you've made about a specific relationship, or a fiercely guarded political ideology you defend online. Hold that conviction in your mind. Now ask yourself this specific question. What specific, objective evidence would it take to make me change my mind?
It is the ultimate diagnostic stress test for your own cognitive flexibility.
Because if you search yourself and your honest answer to that question is nothing, if there is literally no data set, no scientific study, and no human experience that can ever compel you to rethink your position, then you have to admit that you are no longer protecting the truth. You are just fiercely protecting your ego. You are walking onto a chaotic, ever-changing battlefield, entirely blindfolded, convinced that your heavy tools will save you. Drop the tools. Put on your scientist goggles this week. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.